On today's show, we finally tackled DC's New 52. Sort of.
I say sort of because today's entry of the movement was actually part of the second wave of DC's infamous reboot. See, DC relaunched its universe with 52 new titles in 2011. Over time, there was some attrition, and a few books bit the dust. Thing of it is, DC still felt the need to keep publishing 52 titles.
This led DC to revisit some previously used concepts. While some, like Earth 2 or World's Finest, seemed to make a lot of sense, others were a little more perplexing. Case in point, DC's attempt to revive the Green Team.
The Green Team debuted in 1975 and were a group of millionaire boys who would travel the world and reward people who could deliver on the promise of adventure. The group proved so popular that they actually didn't appear for another 15 years, and that was in the mature reader Animal Man book. I guess people really weren't that interested in the adventures of the filthy rich. You know, like that Warren Buffett animated series that aired on the Hub a few years back.
So yeah, DC decided to revive the Green Team in 2013. However, they also decided to provide kind of a counterbook to the Green Team, in the form of the Movement. Whereas the Green Team would be the adventures of the incredibly wealthy, the Movement would be the tales of the downtrodden. It would be a team of superheroes based in the slums of a corrupt city. And yeah, you can pretty much make a Occupy Wall Street analogy here as well. The first 6 issues of the Movement were collected in a storyline called Class Warfare, and that's what we're looking at today.
Coral City is caught in the death grip of those who have sworn to protect it. 2 officers named Whit and Pena harass a young couple, accusing the young man of drug dealing. Whit offers to look the other way. For a price.
No, I'm not going to say what it is he's requesting from the girl. It's a young lady. You look at the way he's looking at her, I think you can draw your own conclusion.
The attempted extortion is interrupted by an individual wearing a hoodie and a metal mask. The person holds up a smartphone with the letters ICU on it. She then plays a recording of Whit's sleazeball move. The officers turn around to find others doing the exact same. Footage of the two is then beamed across social media and eventually gets picked up by the local news. Later, at the precinct, Police Captain Mears confronts Whit and Pena. He tries to suspend the two, but he doesn't actually have the authority to do so.
Yes, it turns out that the Coral City PD is run by the City Council, which is in itself run by several corporate heads. Insert RoboCop reference here.
Meanwhile, a young man stands outside a church. The pastor notices him and takes in the wayward soul. As they enter, the young man says his name is Burden. Later, their murder scene being investigated by Captain Mears and several others. This has been one of many in recent weeks, where the killer has removed the victim's eyeballs and filled the sockets with water. This has earned the killer the name Cornea Killer. The investigation is interrupted by an emergency call from the church. It appears that Burden has turned into some type of demon. As the police head into the church, they're unaware that they are being watched. The officers arrive at a church to confront Burden. It's then that they're interrupted by a rat carrying a message that simply reads, War. Then, suddenly, an individual referring to himself as Mouse bursts through the floor of the church with an army of rats at his side. Outside, several backup officers are confronted by a woman named Tremor. She causes a small earthquake which swallows their police cruisers. Mears starts trying to make his way outside, where he is confronted by the group's leader, a young lady named Virtue. Virtue tells Mears that the group is called the Movement. She then uses her ability to read the captain's emotions. With that, she manages to discover that Mears' wife is having an affair with Mears' underling, Officer Yee. She tells Mears that the area between 10th and 20th Street, known as the Tweens, belongs to the Movement. As this happens, Whit and Pena get beaten up by a woman in a metallic harness named Catharsis. The group leaves with Burden and the officers in tow. Mears rushes into the church to call for backup. However, the pastor reveals to Mears that he and his parishioners have joined the Movement. The Movement takes Whit and Pena down to the group's underground home, which also doubles as a shantytown. It's revealed that the area was once home to an illegal sweatshop, where all the employees had been locked inside during an earthquake. thus getting its name, the sweatshop. Witt and Pena are then confronted by the teenage couple that they harassed earlier. The two are then taken to a makeshift prison where they are introduced to another movement member named Vengeance Moth. Vengeance Moth is left to look after the two prisoners while the other movement members meet about how to move forward. Tremor wants to let the two officers go rather than risk the police coming after them. Catharsis, on the other hand, wants the two dead. Catharsis then asks why is Burden there. He states that he's possessed and he's damned no matter what he does. Returning to the matter at hand, Virtue says no to killing Witt and Pena, calling Catharsis to storm off in a huff.
Well, I guess we know who the Wolverine of the group is.
Catharsis flies to the penthouse of James Cannon, the real estate developer who actually runs Coral City. Catharsis states that 3 investigations into the killings in the tweens were called off. Those orders had to come from someone, likely Cannon. However, Catharsis has set off a silent alarm and a group of armed guards enters. Catharsis puts up a good fight, but she's soon overpowered and arrested. Meanwhile, Virtue leads Mouse, Tremor, and Burden into a section of the city to speak with someone who could help them. They're immediately jumped, but Virtue says she only wants to see the Weather Witch, or as she's more commonly known, Rainmaker.
Rainmaker is more usually known as a member of the Wildstorm Comics universe teen team called Gen 13. Obviously, she has weather-based abilities, and she's of Native American descent. She's also the second Gen 13 member to appear in the New 52, the other being Caitlin Fairchild.
Back at the sweatshop, Vengeance Moth delivers a meal to Witt and Pena, who try to make small talk with the girl in an attempt to discern their location. It doesn't really work. Back with Virtue and the others, they finally get Rainmaker to calm down enough to talk. Virtue informs Rainmaker that the person behind the rash of killings in the tweens appears to have weather-based abilities. The Coral City leaders may be trying to set her up. Rainmaker directs the movement to James Cannon. She goes on to explain that Cannon is really a corporate raider who's been buying up property in Coral City and bleeding it dry so that he can sell it to new developers.
Again, RoboCop.
Virtue asks Rainmaker to join up with the movement, but the Weather Witch declines, citing a desire for her group to be left alone. It's then that Virtue receives a message about Catharsis. Catharsis is brutally questioned by Cannon and a few of his cops. She doesn't sell anyone out, though, and just mocks Cannon. Elsewhere, Virtue pays Captain Mears a visit. She apologizes for the way she told him about his wife. She then makes Mears an offer. Witt and Pena in exchange for Catharsis. Mears turns down the offer, so Virtue takes him over to the window to show him something. Members of the movement have gathered outside the precinct, and they're ready to riot. Mears tries to get Virtue to call off her people. She says it's too late.
Over the course of the riot, a few members of the movement have flashbacks to their origin stories.
Mouse was born into a world of privilege, a world that he was eventually shunned away from due to his emotional connection with a group of rats. Catharsis was a Laotian immigrant who became a Gotham City police officer to honor her late father. However, she took the law into her own hands and castrated a rapist who got away on a technicality. Tremor was the daughter of a Big Alley farmer who moved to America as a teenager after being cast out due to her powers. She fell in with a small gang who one night stole a car and got drunk. She wound up being the only survivor. Lost once more, she came to the attention of a woman named Amanda Waller.
Amanda Waller is a government official in the DC Universe, and she's usually associated with the Task Force X program, which is often referred to as the Suicide Squad. And Waller is kind of the truest definition of an anti-hero. While she isn't necessarily evil, she does often come into conflict with the heroes of the DC Universe.
It turns out that Waller brought Tremor on to infiltrate the movement and bring it down. Burton was the son of Mennonite parents. He always had bouts of shaking violently, which led his parents to believe that he was possessed. So they tied him to his bed and tried to beat the demon out of him. After many fruitless attempts, Burton chose to run away from his family in order to save them. With that, the movement begins working their way towards the police basement and Catharsis, except for Tremor, who stands outside. Tremor sees the government forces approaching and decides to help her friends out, telling Waller she quits in the process. It's then that Rainmaker appears to help out. Eventually, the movement locates and saves Catharsis and begins leaving with her. Mears tries to stop them, but Virtue threatens to have the building leveled, killing everyone inside. Mears reluctantly stands down. Later, news reports begin to filter in about movement spin-off groups popping up around the world. The news of this begins to upset the Coral City leadership, James Cannon in particular. Meanwhile, Captain Mears meets up with an unmasked Virtue. She's okay. Her mask really didn't obscure that much of her face. Mears knows the movement is planning to stream a trial of Witten Pena over the internet. He tells her not to go through with it. Mears points out that the city leadership are bringing in their own super team to take on the movement. Virtue says there's nothing she can do. The trial has already started. Back at the sweatshop, the trial proceeds, with Tremor defending Witten Pena and Catharsis acting as prosecution. When asked for a plea, Pena pleads guilty, while Witt just remains silent. The trial continues, with Tremor arguing that both Witt and Pena have received heroic accommodations for work they've done in the past. Catharsis argues that doesn't give them the right to extort sexual favors from a minor. Witt points out the cops get treated poorly no matter how they act, while Pena just continues to apologize. With that, Vengeance Moth calls for a recess. Meanwhile, Mouse is taking some spare time to compose a letter expressing his feelings for Tremor. It's then that he overhears a streetwalker being threatened by the Cornea Killer. Back at the sweatshop, Witt says he knows that he and Pena are done for, and he begins to stage an escape attempt by knocking Vengeance Moth out of her wheelchair. Catharsis rushes in to stop the two disgraced officers, but she in turn is stopped by Tremor. Tremor directs Witt and Pena to an escape tunnel. Meanwhile, Mouse confronts the Cornea Killer, just when it looks like the Prince of Rats might be gaining the upper hand on the Cornea Killer. The killer introduces some backup in the form of a group called the Graveyard Function. Back at the sweatshop, Tremor and Catharsis come to blows over Witt and Pena's escape. Tremor says that if Catharsis had her way, Witt and Pena would already be dead, which could leave the police to the movement.
Okay, Tremor does have a little bit of a point here. However, letting officers Witt and Pena escape is probably also going to attract police attention.
The fight begins to threaten the structural integrity of the sweatshop, and people begin to flee. Finally, Virtue arrives to bring the fracas to a halt. Tremor explains that everyone was more interested in staging the trial than actually working to catch the Cornea Killer or helping out Burden. Virtue tells Catharsis and Tremor to peacefully talk out their problems, while she begins to help Burden. Burden reveals his true name as Christopher, as Virtue suggests maybe they need to stage an exorcism. Virtue and Vengeance Moth begin to set up the exorcism with all their knowledge, which consists mainly of what they've seen in movies. Christopher's demon comes out and begins taunting Virtue, implying that her father was once a police officer. Virtue takes some sports drink, they couldn't find any holy water, and begins splashing it onto the demon. She then uses her powers to remove Christopher's fear. Christopher is apparently now cured. Meanwhile, Catharsis and Tremor hash out their problems over ice cream. Catharsis states that her history as a police officer is what influenced her with Witt and Pena. Tremor states that what the movement is doing is bigger than just temporary revenge on dirty cops, and that she does worry about Catharsis. The two call a truce and exit the diner, only to find Mouse strung up from a power line, with his throat slit.
And that ends the first 6 issues of The Movement. Yeah, I know the story ends on a cliffhanger. I'll touch on that in just a minute. However, the story really does have a lot going for it. I think the characters are really developed on both sides, both the heroes and villains, and that does make the story much, much more intriguing. And the artwork is pretty consistent throughout. However, like I said, the fact that it does end on a cliffhanger, it makes the story kind of feel a little half-finished. If they had maybe ended this with issue 4 instead of issue 6, you know, with the end of the prison riot and Catharsis being freed, I think that would have felt more like a complete story. Just my opinion. Also, this is kind of a unique part. I have to complain about the coloring in this. In the beginning parts of the story, Officer Pena seems to have a much darker complexion. He almost looks black. And then suddenly his skin starts to lighten up throughout the story, and then it kind of starts to darken again. I don't understand what's going on there. But admittedly, that's a bit of a nitpick. And really, I have no problem giving The Movement a B. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review. Look, if you ever go back to the first video I did announcing this show, I did state that, yeah, we would occasionally be covering reference material for comics. Well, these are reference material.